Hello, this is Professor Stephen Robinson. I'm going to do a little quick demo on slips and underglazes and ideas around brushwork. In this video lecture, I'm going to cover some of its reiteration on ideas around the types of brushes you use. If you go out and purchase a variety of different brushes, either at the hardware store or an art supply store or through a clay supply store, there's all these different kinds. Like here's a kind of a sumi brush. You could do a lot of calligraphy in fat line and thin line, all with this one brush. You see it, hold it up there. See the tip of the brush. Can be really tight, but you can push down on it and you can do a thicker line too. And just learning how to use that brush could take you a long time. This is a good brush called a hake brush, or a flat brush like this. This is natural hair compared to like a nylon bristle. I don't really use nylon bristles too much, but sometimes they work for some things. Those sponge brushes sometimes work for some things. But to get a nice coverage, I like these kind of brushes to cover areas. So I'm looking at like this picture, for instance, these kind of swatches of white and these other colors that I've added with that underglaze. That's the kind of brush that I would use. If I want to cover a whole piece, I might use a brush like this. Now remember, there's other ways to apply underglaze and slips, and later on glazes too, where you can spray, you can dip, you can pour. You're limited on these smaller things. Obviously, you can't fill up a bucket and dip it. But there's other ways to think about application of it. Just as a painter applies with a palette knife or a sable brush compared to a big fat nylon brush, it's the same thing. So you are a painter in this process, and you got to think about it that way. So as you learn the brushes and control them, that's part of that dexterity that you'll slowly build. You look at different directions you want to go. This brush is from my old dog, Gersley. He was a black dog who had really long, good hair for brushes. And I just like this brush to show you how stupid you can do. A brush is just a piece of wood with some tape and some hair taped to it, and it's a brush. And I use this brush and brushes like this to do these more straight line, and you can lay it on there like this. So see more straight line black lines. I'll show you on the surface of this picture. If I take that brush, I'm not going to hold it up and down. I'm going to think about laying it in the area I want and drawing it across the surface like that. You can use underglaze. Black on the bottom isn't the best idea, but in a wood fire or a soda fire process, I can think about like where I might put a wad right here and a wad here and here, you know, and I can wad around that black underglaze. So you can work the bottom. I think working the bottom of your piece is quite often a really great way to think about the whole piece, the inside, the outside, the bottom. These are things that you should be taking into account. So with the same brush, I'll show you that I can think about a line that's straight, like I said. Or if I want to pull a line around in a circle, I can do a curve with the brush, and you can see how I can circle around with this brush too. All right. These brushes, like this brush here, that I brought up first time, these more calligraphy brushes or sumi brushes, they're good for all kinds of things, straight lines. So I'd like just show you to emphasize that this brush could do the same thing that that brush did. If I want to do a straight line right here, let's say, I can do the same thing, but it would be the same way I hold it. So I'm dragging it, and I push down on it a little, and I got it fatter. So line variation, as you know from drawing, you know, like you can go around curves and add weight to the line. You can lift that brush up and get a finer line and have have a line that even disappears. I like it when a line disappears and then the mind fills in that line as you're looking at the painting, or the, in this case, the picture. So how you handle your pieces, you know, with a pitcher, it's easy to stick my hand inside it. With plates and bowls and other things that you all making, or sculptural objects, you think about how you handle it very carefully. Because in the application process, if you read the back of them, or if we use a studio slip later, you might want to use it on bisqueware. And if it's some slips you can't use on bisqueware, most, but most underglazes you can use on bisqueware, and then handling it is a little easier. This is a greenware piece, so it's at a leather hard, it's closer to bone dry actually now. I like to do it at leather hard, so I can put this one down and show you. You saw how white that one was compared to this picture, which has got less white to it. So you're starting to learn more about bone dry and leather hard. I like to do it close to a leather hard stage for some things, and I like to do it at a bone dry or a bis stage if I want to get a dry brush, where the brush kind of gets loaded up when you put it down, and then it kind of goes like a skid mark almost. So a dry brush technique might be something to play with too. So again, calligraphy, if you think about how you get into actually doing lettering, or how you can actually paint with a brush like this to get a certain line variation, is something to take into account. So that's kind of really just 3 different brushes to throw out at you. Remember, a brush can have its own voice, and you choose that brush for certain things. So you start to learn your brushes. So I tell you all, you should purchase some brushes, get used to them. You'll find a favorite one for certain things, and as you start to learn how to paint underglaze and slips on your pieces, you'll just get better and better at it. So that's the idea of like underglazes and slips. They're one animal that you use. So you have these different things that you can think about, and there could be an animal that's you never see, very ghosty. So that would be like, if you look at glass, you can have glass that's translucent, right? You can also have glass that's opaque, or glass that you never see. So with slips, you're always going to see it. But with glaze, you might have something that's more transparent. But these are the 3 kind of animals. One that's just transparent, you never see it. One that's a little ghosty or has a veil. Translucency is a word to think about. And then there's the opacity of underglazes, slips, and glazes. So these are kind of how we play with the layering on the surfaces of our work, and we can convey certain things through that opacity that we couldn't convey through a transparent kind of thing or a translucent kind of thing. So if we have a light, fluffy cloud, for instance, I'm going to be Bob Ross, light, fluffy cloud. You know, you have this idea that, you know, you can't have a big, opaque, chunky white. Well, you could, but I mean, if you want a light, fluffy cloud, you would have a opacity with your slip or your underglaze that would be thinner. So you could say, read the back of these bottles, and the back of a bottle of slip has like certain things, and it'll say 3 coats, 3 flowing coats. But this one actually says for an opaque coverage. So, you know, you think about the coverage, and just like in other painting techniques, you can use things to thin the paint down. Watercolor, obviously, you use water. Turpentine for washes with oil paints. And so with this, it's all water-based, so you're a lot safer than dealing with terpenoids. But you can think about how you can play with any painting style that you've done in the past, if you've ever painted, and incorporate that into your work. But you can start to learn how to do watercolor kind of techniques with underglazes, slips, and glazes like Maiolica glaze, and then overglazes with high fire stuff. So in a nutshell, that's basically what you all need to think about as you're treating the surface of your work. Outside of the sculptural applications of doing additive and subtractive techniques that you're learning as techniques build in your toolbox, you remember that you're also a painter. So that's one of the challenges. If you're a utilitarian person, you are limited to certain things sculpturally, but you're probably not limited to anything as a painter. And you can push those boundaries and it could still have a purpose of utility. It could still be a coffee cup with some texture on it. So, but how much appendages on it will negate the use of that coffee cup, that's really up to you. And that's where you can push the limits of even just a simple thing, which isn't so simple, as a cup, okay? So remember what I said about, face-to-face lecture. I talked about how you are working with three-dimensional canvases. And remember the fact that canvas is fairly new compared to ceramics. Ceramics has been used as a vehicle for expression for thousands and thousands of years longer. The wall, of course, is some of the oldest ways that we've expressed ourselves. But in utilitarian and sculptural applications, think about it. It is a three-dimensional canvas. Think about the composition, how line, as paint, as color fields, as imagery, flow around that surface of that three-dimensional piece that you've made. And in turn, as a sculptor, think about negative space also in the physical, like if you think about a handle on that picture, for instance, that negative space, both ergonomically, physical balance, and visual balance are things as a utilitarianist may take into account. But as a sculptor, you play with that. Could that negative space of a handle be indicative of a profile of a person or of a shape of the belly of a bird or the beak on a bird or something that's representational? Yes, so as a sculptor, you can play with negative space and then positive form. So as a painter, though, you're thinking about some of that negative space issues too, and you're thinking about playing with depth on the surface of your work, a visual depth less than a physical depth. So the depth as a sculptor, same thing in turn as a painter. And I think that's where underglazes and slips, and then later on glazes or different atmospheric firing techniques can be employed to really push your concept and your aesthetic, and that's something to really take into account that you look at. One last thing about slips and underglazes is what's cool about them, to some degree, they stay where you put them. So if you really want to do a lot of detail work, sometimes glaze is not the way to do it because the glaze could flow. Underglazes could flow too, and slips could flow too. You get it too hot, it can become a glaze, or if it's in an atmospheric firing, that atmosphere and the glazing can sometimes pull things around. But generally speaking, that's one reason why you might use underglazes over glazes. So slips and underglazes, you can think about them as they stay where you put them, whereas glazes sometimes get this flow, okay? And there's a good play between those two that you start looking at as you advance with your work. Here's that idea of dry brush and that kind of surface that you can get as you work on a little bit of a drier piece. You can let the brush kind of skip across there. And anyway, you want to think about like compositionally how you play with it, whether it be abstract or representational imagery that you play with. You want to think compositionally and how you, again, play with the whole piece. That's good 15 minutes of an overview and a reiteration of what I've already talked to you a little bit about. But just to push that home, where do you go with it? bounce ideas off of me. I'm going to talk about resist techniques in the next video and just go over slips and underglazes with paper resists. There's several other resist techniques, and I'll talk about those, but I'm going to cover paper resists. All right. Don't forget, contact me, any questions, I'm available. If there's any clarity you need on any of the assignments as you're going, make sure you use me as much as possible. All right? Have a good day. Talk to you later.